It began with a letter. A plain white envelope tucked neatly under the doormat, sealed with the HOA's distinctive logo. Mark almost missed it that morning, distracted by his coffee and the faint hum of sprinklers echoing across the pristine cul-de-sac. It was a quiet neighborhood. Too quiet, in a way that came from strict enforcement of the HOA's countless regulations. Every lawn was symmetrical, every mailbox identical, and every house painted one of 3 approved shades of beige. Mark had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for 5 years. He wasn't a troublemaker. He paid his dues, trimmed his hedges, and even participated in the annual block cleanup. But over time, he noticed how rules seemed to multiply like weeds. The HOA board, led by a sharp-tongued woman named Karen Baxter, had recently grown more aggressive, targeting residents for minor violations.
Lawn too long warning.
Fence slightly discolored, fine. Holiday decorations up a day too early, citation. So when Mark opened the envelope, he wasn't surprised, but he wasn't prepared for what he read either. The letter accused him of violating HOA visual harmony standards by leaving his trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection day. $8.75 fine was attached with a warning that future offenses would result in compounded penalties. He stared at the paper in disbelief. His trash can sat neatly by the garage, tucked beside the driveway. The collectors always came early, and he'd bring them in that evening. Apparently, someone, and he had a good guess who, had photographed them within that narrow, unforgiving window. Mark initially shrugged it off. He could afford $75, but it was the principle that irritated him. It wasn't about cleanliness or aesthetics, it was about control. Karen and her cronies seemed to take pleasure in asserting authority over the smallest details of residents' lives. He decided to push back, filing a formal appeal with the HOA's compliance committee. He even attached photos showing that his bins were neatly aligned and well maintained. But 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived, his appeal denied. The reasoning was as rigid as the community itself. Rules exist for consistency, and consistency maintains property values. That's when something inside Mark shifted. He started noticing things. How Karen's house had a new mailbox that technically violated the HOA's approved model list. How her garden lights shone well past the 10 p.m. curfew. How her driveway had a visible crack that hadn't been sealed within the required maintenance window. The hypocrisy burned like fuel. But rather than retaliate in anger, Mark began to think creatively. If they cared so much about the visibility of his trash cans, then he'd make sure they became unmissable. He spent a few evenings sketching ideas in his garage. What if, instead of hiding his bins, he showcased them, proudly, absurdly, in a way that turned the HOA's obsession into a spectacle? That night, an idea was born. He would build something so ridiculous, so over the top, that the HOA's own rules would collapse under their pettiness. He called it the Trash Castle Project. He began by researching local zoning regulations, structure permits, and what technically counted as landscaping enhancement. He discovered a loophole: as long as a structure was decorative, didn't exceed 8 feet in height, and didn't attach to the main dwelling, it didn't require prior HOA approval. Perfect. Mark gathered materials from local hardware stores: stone, patterned panels, fox columns, decorative archways. He even ordered a few gargoyle statues online for flair. The project started small, just a wall to conceal the bins. But as he built, his imagination expanded. Towers, a gate, maybe even a tiny drawbridge for dramatic effect. It became more than a statement, it became art. Each weekend, neighbors stopped by to watch. Some laughed, others cheered quietly behind their blinds. Everyone knew what this was really about. The HOA's pettiness had finally met its match. By the 3rd week, the Trash Castle stood proudly at the edge of Mark's driveway. 2 stone towers framed his garbage bins like prized relics. A banner hung between them with the words, "Refuse Royalty," in gold paint. The gargoyles perched at the corners, and twinkling solar lights gave the structure a faint, majestic glow at night. Mark stood back, hands on hips, and smiled. It was absurd, yes, but it was perfect. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Karen's SUV rolled by. She slowed down, her eyes wide, her mouth tightening into a grim line as she took in the sight. Mark could practically hear her blood pressure rising. The next morning, another letter appeared. This one was thicker, filled with printed regulations, citations, and veiled threats of escalating fines. The HOA demanded immediate removal of the unauthorized structure. They accused him of violating multiple guidelines: architectural inconsistency, would approve decorative construction and visual disturbance. Mark didn't even flinch. He read it calmly, then pinned it to his workshop corkboard next to the first letter. Trophies of their growing frustration. The neighborhood was buzzing now. Some thought he'd gone too far. Others secretly admired his defiance. A few even began decorating their own yards with whimsical touches emboldened by his rebellion. Plastic flamingos, gnome villages, colorful murals. Oak Ridge Estates was starting to look less like a clone army of houses and more like a living community. Karen, however, was livid. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, determined to make an example of him. But Mark was ready. He had documentation, legal precedents, and the zoning code highlighted in bright yellow. His castle wasn't just a joke. It was bulletproof under the rules they themselves had written. Still, he knew this was just the beginning. Karen wouldn't stop until she crushed him completely. But Mark wasn't afraid. In fact, the more they pushed, the more determined he became to turn the entire situation into something spectacular, something no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. Because this wasn't just about trash cans anymore. It was about freedom, creativity, and the right to push back when the rules stopped making sense. As he stood beneath the glow of his castle lights that night, a quiet grin spread across his face. The HOA thought they could fine him into submission, but they had just declared war on the wrong homeowner. By the next week, the HOA's war machine was in full motion. The trash castle had not only disrupted the neighborhood's sterile harmony, it had sparked a quiet revolution. Homeowners who had once cowered under the board's scrutiny were suddenly emboldened. They smiled at Mark when they saw him outside, whispering praise, though none dared openly take his side. The HOA had eyes everywhere, and Karen Baxter was its all-seeing queen. The board issued a new letter, this one written in aggressive legalese in hand, delivered by Karen herself. She walked up the driveway in her crisp white blouse, clipboard in hand, her expression radiating forced politeness. She didn't speak, just handed him the letter and took a long, judgmental look at the castle before retreating. The document claimed that Mark's structure violated the spirit of the community aesthetic. That vague phrase was new, likely crafted overnight by Karen's inner circle. It accused him of creating a distraction that undermines the collective property value and visual peace. It also mentioned that the board had voted to impose daily fines of $50 until the unauthorized monument was removed. Mark almost laughed. He'd expected this. The HOA's strategy was intimidation through paperwork, a slow bleed of bureaucracy meant to crush resistance. But he wasn't alone this time. The neighbors had begun to stir. Across the street, the Myers family had painted their mailbox bright yellow in honor of artistic expression. A few doors down, someone placed a miniature garden gnome on their lawn holding a sign that said, "Viva la Trash Castle." Small gestures, but noticeable ones. Karen's empire of conformity was starting to crack. Mark decided to play smart. Instead of tearing anything down, he expanded his project carefully, legally, and with flair. He consulted city ordinances and construction guidelines, ensuring every nail and panel complied with local law. He even filed for a decorative landscaping permit, framing the entire castle as a thematic yard installation. When inspectors came, they found nothing out of compliance. Everything met the legal definitions, barely, but enough to make their reports airtight. The OA's outrage grew, but their power stopped where municipal jurisdiction began. Mark upgraded the castle further. He added stained glass windows made from colored acrylic sheets, a small lit mode effect around the base, and a wooden crest engraved with the initials, HRC, his refused castle. What started as mockery was evolving into something impressive, almost majestic. People slowed their cars to admire it, and kids begged their parents to stop for pictures. Then, one night, the HOA struck again, this time under cover of darkness. Mark woke to the sound of scraping and a faint clang. He looked out the window and saw two shadows near the castle. By the time he ran outside, they were gone, but a section of the outer paneling had been pried loose, leaving a jagged scar in the structure. He documented everything, photos, timestamps, even security camera footage from a neighbor's Ring doorbell showing two figures resembling Karen and another board member. He didn't confront them immediately. Instead, he sent a copy of the footage to the HOA's official email address with a polite note. "It seems someone attempted unauthorized maintenance on my legally permitted decorative structure. Please advise." The silence that followed was deafening. Days passed with no official response, but the whispers around the neighborhood grew louder. Word of the break-in attempt spread fast. The HOA once feared was now becoming a source of ridicule. People mocked Karen's crusade against the trash monarch. Online community forums filled with memes and jokes about it. Someone even photoshopped Karen's face onto a dragon guarding HOA paperwork. Mark knew this was his moment. He decided to go public, not just within the neighborhood, but online. He made a short video showing the evolution of his castle, from the first wall panel to the full structure. He narrated calmly, explaining the original fine, the escalating demands, and how he simply decided to embrace the absurd. He uploaded it to a homeowners' rights forum, then to social media. Within a week, the post exploded. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments. People from across the country were cheering him on. Trash Castle Guy became a minor internet sensation. News outlets picked up the story, spinning it into headlines about one man's creative protest against HOA tyranny. Karen was livid. The HOA's reputation was in ruins. She called another emergency meeting, this time to vote on disciplinary action against Mark for bringing negative attention to the community. But when the notice went out, half the homeowners refused to attend. The tide had turned completely. The next morning, a news van pulled into the cold D-Sac. A local reporter wanted to film the castle and interview its creator. Mark agreed, but he made sure to keep his tone calm, factual, and neighborly. He wasn't the villain here, he was the homeowner who stood up for reason. The segment aired that night, and the HOA's overreach was broadcast for everyone to see. Public opinion flooded against them. The board's inbox filled with angry emails from viewers demanding they leave that poor man alone. Mark stood on his porch that evening, the castle glowing softly behind him, and watched as Karen's UV rolled past again. Her face was pale, eyes darting toward the cameras parked at the corner. For the first time, she looked uncertain. The HOA wasn't used to being on defense. But Mark knew better than to think the war was over. Karen wasn't the kind of person who surrendered easily. She'd double down. She always did. The next day, a certified letter arrived. This one was thicker than all the rest. Inside was a formal notice of special assessment to cover the costs of public relations damage control and neighborhood reputation restoration. The fee, $250 per household. The residents were furious. For the first time, they saw where their money was going. Not toward improvements, but toward silencing dissent. And so, a movement began. The Trash Castle, once a personal project, was becoming a symbol, not just of one man's defiance, but of a community's awakening. The HOA had built its power on silence and compliance. Now it faced laughter, mockery, and rebellion. Mark could feel the tide shifting completely. But deep down, he knew Karen wasn't done. There was one more move left in her, something bigger, something desperate. And when she made it, he planned to be ready. Karen Baxter wasn't used to losing control. For years, her word had been law in the community. She could summon citations, fines, and threats with the stroke of a pen, and people obeyed. But now, her authority was slipping through her fingers like sand. The Trash Castle had turned into something she couldn't contain, a symbol of defiance and creativity that mocked everything she represented. Still, Karen wasn't the kind to retreat quietly. She called in reinforcements. The HOA board expanded its operations, hiring an outside legal consultant and even attempting to involve city zoning enforcement again. They searched for any technicality, any overlooked clause that could justify tearing down Mark's monument once and for all. Mark could feel the pressure mounting. The HOA's latest letter accused him of environmental disruption, claiming that his structure might attract pests or cause rainwater pooling. It was desperate, ridiculous, and transparent, but also dangerous. The more Karen escalated, the more likely she'd find a bureaucrat willing to side with her just to avoid the noise. So, Mark went further. He transformed the Trash Castle into a masterpiece. Using weather-resistant paint and some reclaimed wood, he expanded it into an entire themed display. The Castle of Reclamation. He incorporated recycled materials, transforming discarded cans into decorative shields, old tires into flower planters, and leftover bricks into a miniature drawbridge. What had once been a clever prank was now a legitimate art installation. Visitors started coming from outside the neighborhood just to see it. Cars would stop at the curb for photos, and local artists left small contributions. Painted rocks, metal sculptures, even mosaic tiles. The HOA's attempts to frame it as unsightly backfired spectacularly. It became the pride of the area, even drawing coverage in regional art blogs. Karen was furious. To her, this wasn't just about a pile of garbage turned mart. It was about control. She saw Mark as a threat to her entire system of order. If he could defy her and win, what would stop others from doing the same? Her next move was ruthless. One morning, Mark woke to find city trucks lined up in front of his house. A crew of men in reflective vests stood around holding clipboards. Apparently an anonymous complaint had been filed, claiming his installation was a public safety hazard. Karen stood across the street, pretending to water her flowers, but clearly watching every moment unfold. Mark stepped outside calmly. He greeted the crew, handed them his permits, and explained everything. The materials used, the permits obtained, the inspections passed. The foreman nodded, impressed. After a thorough check, the city workers confirmed that everything was compliant and left without issue. Karen's expression as the trucks drove away was priceless. The quiet rage on her face said it all. She had failed again, and this time in front of an audience. But she wasn't finished. That night, as darkness settled over the street, the castle glowed faintly with solar lights. It had become a neighborhood landmark, but also a target. Around midnight, a loud crash shattered the peace. Mark rushed outside, and his heart sank. Someone had tried to destroy the castle. Pieces of decorative paneling were ripped off, paint was smeared, and one of the stained glass windows was shattered. The moat lights were torn up, wires dangling in the dirt. It was deliberate, malicious, and personal. He checked his security cameras, and the footage was undeniable. Karen herself, along with another board member, sneaking across the yard, vandalizing the display with what looked like a hammer and spray paint. This time, Mark didn't email the footage. He took it to the police. The next morning, 2 officers arrived at Karen's door. The whole street watched as they spoke with her for nearly half an hour. Her confident smile faltered. Her hands fluttered nervously as she tried to explain herself. Eventually, the officers handed her a paper, a summons for property damage and trespassing. The neighborhood buzzed for days. The mighty HOA president had finally crossed a line even her title couldn't protect her from. Some neighbors defended her, saying it was misunderstanding, but most were done being afraid. People started openly criticizing her leadership. Some even demanded her resignation. The HOA board held an emergency meeting again, but this time Mark wasn't the one under scrutiny. Karen was. She tried to spin the story, claiming she'd only been inspecting the structure for safety concerns, but the video was impossible to dispute. The board voted to suspend her indefinitely pending the outcome of the investigation. Mark didn't celebrate. He knew victory wasn't just about Karen's downfall. It was about the larger system that allowed someone like her to wield unchecked power over homeowners. The trash castle wasn't just his defiance anymore. It had become a message. He decided to rebuild, bigger, better, brighter. With help from neighbors, he repaired the damage and added new elements, a small courtyard made of reclaimed brick, decorative lighting, and even a sign that read, "Community Castle, built by us." It was no longer just his project. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been fined, threatened, or silenced by the HOA. As the structure neared completion, the neighborhood transformed. People began painting their fences, adding garden art, planting wildflowers, all the things they'd once been afraid to do. For the first time in years, individuality replaced uniformity. Karen watched from her window as her kingdom crumbled around her. She had one last move left, a final, desperate attempt to restore her rule. And when she made it, it would shake the entire community. Because Karen wasn't planning to fight the battle on the streets anymore. She was taking it to court. Karen's final weapon wasn't a fine or a threat. It was a lawsuit. When Mark received the envelope in his mailbox, he could already guess what was inside. It was thick, heavy with legal jargon, and stamped with the HOA's seal. She was suing him on behalf of the association for unauthorized construction, community devaluation, and emotional distress caused by public defamation. It was the last desperate act of someone who refused to let go of power. The neighborhood buzzed with disbelief. Karen had truly lost it. After being suspended and humiliated, she was now dragging her personal vendetta into the courtroom. For Mark, though, it was no surprise. He knew Karen's personality by now. Control wasn't something she could surrender quietly. If she couldn't rule the HOA, she would attempt to destroy it from the outside. The lawsuit was a direct attack. It demanded not only that the trash castle be removed immediately, but also that Mark pay thousands in damages and legal fees. She claimed it had caused reputational harm to the neighborhood, alleging that news coverage of the art installation had made the community look foolish and non-compliant. Mark read the papers in silence, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. But instead of lashing out, he began preparing. He documented every permit, every inspection, every public endorsement. He had video proof, photographs, and written records that the structure was safe, approved, and celebrated by the city. The law was on his side. Karen was fighting a battle she couldn't possibly win. Yet, Karen wasn't acting rationally anymore. She had become consumed by resentment. Her once immaculate front yard was now neglected, her perfect hedges uneven, her pristine welcome sign fading under the sun. She spent her days drafting statements, emailing reporters, and arguing with former allies who'd turned against her. She didn't care if she won, she only wanted Mark to lose. The court date approached. On the morning of the hearing, the small county courtroom filled with curious neighbors and even a few local reporters. The story of the HOA president who sued a man over a trash castle had gained traction online, turning their quiet suburb into a minor viral sensation. Karen entered the courtroom with the same stiff posture she always had, clutching a binder filled with documents and handwritten notes. Her lawyer, clearly uncomfortable, tried to maintain composure as Mark's attorney, provided pro bono by a local legal aid group, laid out the evidence. The judge listened carefully. Every accusation Karen made was dismantled by hard facts. The castle was built within property boundaries. All materials were approved. City inspectors had confirmed compliance multiple times. The structure, far from devaluing the neighborhood, had actually drawn positive attention and even increased property interest. When the video of Karen vandalizing the castle was shown, the entire courtroom shifted. Karen's lawyer buried his face in his hands. The judge's expression hardened. What had started as a civil case quickly revealed itself as a personal vendetta fueled by malice. By the end of the hearing, the decision was swift and devastating for Karen. The case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile it. The judge also imposed fines for filing frivolous claims and wasting court resources. But what truly broke her was the final statement. The judge publicly acknowledged Mark's project as an act of community expression and lawful improvement of private property. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Karen sat frozen, staring at the bench as if the ground beneath her had vanished. Outside, reporters surrounded Mark. They wanted his reaction, but he stayed calm, repeating that it wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for fairness and creativity. The story spread fast, appearing on local news and online outlets. Homeowner wins against its sheer tyranny. One headline read. Another called it a victory for art over authority. Back in the neighborhood, things changed dramatically. Without Karen's influence, the HOA board held emergency elections. The remaining members, embarrassed and exhausted, voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Years of control, restrictions, and fear vanished overnight. For the first time in decades, residents could make their own choices without arbitrary fines or power games. Karen, however, refused to accept defeat. She isolated herself completely. The once busy president who dictated every fence height and flower color now kept her curtains drawn. She rarely left the house. The neighbors whispered that she might move away, but she didn't. It was as if she was chained to the power she'd lost, unable to leave the battlefield she'd created. Meanwhile, Mark continued improving the trash castle. With help from friends, he expanded it into a public display of creativity, part art, part community center. Children painted new panels, local artists donated sculptures, and families hosted small gatherings around it. What began as a rebellion against pettiness had become a celebration of freedom. Still, beneath the surface of victory, Mark felt a strange sense of sadness. Karen's downfall, though justified, had come at a cost. Watching her unravel reminded him how easily control could consume someone. The HOA system had turned neighbors into enemies, and though he had won, he couldn't ignore the damage left behind. As weeks passed, the castle gained a new feature, a tall, arched entryway with an inscription carved above it. It read, "Creativity builds what control destroys." The neighborhood thrived again. Lawns grew unique, fences painted in colors unseen before. The street, once uniform and cold, became alive with individuality. But as Mark stood one evening beneath the glow of his solar lights, he noticed a shadow standing by the edge of his property. Karen, watching silently. There was no clipboard, no smug expression, no sign of authority left. Just quiet bitterness and something that almost looked like regret. She turned and disappeared into the night. Mark knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen didn't vanish, they simmered, waiting for a chance to reclaim what they'd lost. And deep down, he suspected she had one more move left. Months had passed since the court's ruling, but peace in the neighborhood was fragile. Though the HOA had been officially dissolved, remnants of its influence still lingered. Some homeowners missed the illusion of order it once provided, whispering that maybe Karen had been bit extreme, but necessary. Others, however, flourished in the freedom that followed, decorating, building, and planting however they pleased. Mark remained at the heart of this transformation. The trash castle had evolved far beyond its original purpose. It had become a symbol of defiance, of creativity, and of the community reclaiming its voice. What began as a fence of recycled materials now stood tall with mosaics, solar lanterns, and intricate carvings contributed by dozens of residents. Children called it the Freedom Fortress, and every weekend, people gathered around it to share stories, food, and laughter. But freedom, as Mark had learned, often attracts opposition, and the opposition was brewing once again, this time from the shadows of bureaucracy. Karen, though disgraced publicly, had not given up her obsession. She had found a new way to exert control. After being banned from HOA positions, she had started working behind the scenes, filing complaints to city zoning boards, health departments, and even the county planning office. Each report targeted the trash castle, citing unsafe construction, unsanitary conditions, and public nuisance. Mark began receiving letters again. This time, not from an HOA, but from various city departments demanding inspections. Every week, another envelope arrived, another attempt to dismantle what he'd built. He realized quickly that this wasn't coincidence. This was Karen's doing, weaponizing bureaucracy the way she once used HOA rules. The inspectors came, one after another. But each time, they found nothing wrong. The structure was solid. The permits were valid. The property lines were intact. The health codes were followed to the letter. Every inspection ended the same, with an apology and a quiet admiration for how well it was maintained. Still, the harassment continued. Karen didn't care about winning anymore. Her goal was exhaustion. If she couldn't make Mark tear it down through force, she'd bury him in paperwork and frustration until he gave up voluntarily. Mark, however, refused to yield. Instead, he went on the offensive again. He began documenting everything, not just the letters and visits, but also the impact the trash castle had on the community. He filmed the art workshops, the family picnics, the school visits. He collected testimonials from neighbors who credited the space for bringing them closer together. Soon, he had an idea, one that would not only protect his project but immortalize it. He launched an online campaign, From Trash to Treasure, the story of our neighborhood reborn. The short video he posted showed how a petty HOA fine had evolved into a full-blown community movement. Within days, it went viral. News stations picked it up, influencers reposted it, and even local officials commented positively on the project's impact. Donations began pouring in from strangers who wanted to support, or against authority. But the most powerful effect wasn't online. It was local. Seeing the overwhelming public support, the city mayor herself visited the site. She was impressed not only by the craftsmanship, but by the story behind it. She declared the trash castle an official community art landmark, granting it protected status under local cultural preservation laws. The moment the certificate was handed to Mark, he knew Karen's campaign was finished. She could file every complaint she wanted. Now, the city itself recognized his creation as art. The announcement devastated her. Neighbors watched from behind their windows as Karen's composure finally crumbled. Her home, once the symbol of immaculate perfection, was in disarray. The pristine white facade was peeling, her flowers wilted, and the once trimmed hedges had grown wild. She had poured so much of herself into control that without it, she seemed to collapse entirely. Still, Mark didn't celebrate. He had won, yes, but the victory felt bittersweet. Watching someone destroy themselves through obsession left a hollow feeling in his chest. The castle had brought him joy and connection, but it had also revealed the ugliness that power could breed. The city held a small ceremony to unveil a plaque at the base of the trash castle, engraved with the words, a monument to creativity born from conflict. Proof that expression will always outshine control. As the crowd applauded, Mark looked across the street. Karen was standing at her window, arms folded, her eyes dark and unreadable. She wasn't cheering. She wasn't crying. She was simply watching, like a ghost trapped in the world she'd tried to command. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. The sound of crickets mixed with faint whispers of wind through the recycled metal panels of the castle. For the first time, it felt different, almost somber. The fight was over, yet something inside him said it wasn't truly done, because control doesn't die easily. And Karen, for all her silence, wasn't done watching. The following spring arrived with the kind of beauty that only comes after a long struggle. The lawns bloomed freely, fences were painted in bold colors, and life filled the once quiet cul-de-sac. The HOA was gone, Karen's grip had been broken, and the neighborhood was finally alive again. Yet, the scars of what had happened remained in subtle ways, not visible, but deeply felt. Mark's trash castle had become more than a monument, it was a pilgrimage site of sorts. Families from nearby towns came to see it, take photos, and hear the story. Journalists covered it as a symbol of resistance against overreach. Teachers brought art students to learn how creativity could challenge authority. What had started as defiance had become inspiration. But behind the glory and the visitors, Mark noticed small changes, a strange quiet across the street. Karen's house sat in eerie stillness. The once white shutters were now faded gray. The yard, once trimmed like a military parade ground, was overgrown with dandelions. Her car hadn't moved in weeks. At first, Mark thought she had moved away. But one evening, he saw her, standing silently at her front door, watching as children played near the trash castle. She looked thinner, older, and utterly defeated. Yet her eyes still burned with that familiar resentment, not loud anymore, but cold and enduring. He realized then that her downfall hadn't brought her peace. It had left her empty. The HOA, the rules, the control, all of it had been her identity. Without it, she had nothing left to fight for. And for the first time, Mark didn't feel anger toward her. He felt pity. The castle's fame continued to grow, attracting media crews and tourists. It became a small cultural landmark, and with it came attention, both good and bad. Some residents loved the recognition, while others complained about the increased traffic and noise. Ironically, the neighborhood was starting to resemble the kind of chaos Karen had always feared. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, a soft knock came at Mark's door. It was one of the newer neighbors, a young man named Brian who'd moved in recently. He mentioned that Karen's house had no lights on for days and her mail was piling up. Concerned, Mark walked over with him. They found her sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring toward the trash castle. Her expression was calm, almost peaceful. She greeted them weakly, admitting she hadn't been well. Age, loneliness, and regret had caught up to her. Mark didn't know what to say. For years, she had been his nemesis, the cause of his stress, anger, and sleepless nights. Yet now, she seemed like just another person who'd lost her way. He offered her help, not out of obligation, but out of humanity. Over the next few weeks, he and some neighbors began assisting her quietly. Groceries, yard work, small repairs. At first, she resisted, but slowly she softened. She started waving to the children again, even smiling occasionally. It wasn't much, but it was something. The neighborhood watched in quiet amazement. The woman who had once fined people for leaving trash cans out was now accepting kindness from the very people she had tormented. It was as if the community she'd once controlled was now saving her from herself. One afternoon, Karen visited the trash castle for the first time. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning every recycled panel, every mosaic piece. She stopped at the plaque, reading the engraved words aloud to herself. Her hand brushed the metal lightly, and she stood there for a long time. Then, without a word, she turned and walked home. No one ever knew what went through her mind that day. But after that visit, something changed. She became quieter, gentler, and more present. When children rode their bikes past her driveway, she waved. When neighbors chatted, she nodded politely. The war that had defined her for so long was finally over. Months later, when she passed away peacefully in her sleep, the neighborhood didn't react with bitterness, but with respect. They remembered her as complicated, flawed, but ultimately human. At her memorial, Mark spoke briefly, telling the story of how their battles had unexpectedly shaped the best parts of their community. Afterward, he returned to the trash castle, standing beneath the lanterns that now illuminated it every night. The air was cool, carrying the soft sounds of laughter and life. He looked up at the towers he'd built and thought about everything they represented, rebellion, redemption, and resilience. What began as anger had turned into art. What began as punishment had become pride. And what began as a fight between two stubborn neighbors had transformed an entire neighborhood. The city eventually expanded the landmark, adding a small park area around it. A sign now read, "The Trash Castle," built from defiance, sustained by community. It wasn't just Mark's story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, conform, or obey without question. And though Karen's house stood empty across the street, her presence lingered, not as a ghost of conflict, but as a reminder that even the harshest rivalries can leave behind lessons worth keeping. That night, as the lights from the castle shimmered against the dark sky, Mark smiled. The battle was long over, but the story, their story, would live on. It was no longer about trash cans, fines, or feuds. It was about something far greater: how a single act of defiance could rebuild an entire sense of community. And as the lanterns flickered softly, the trash castle stood tall, a monument not to rebellion, but to transformation.